Hello, everyone. In continuation to our series of SAP and Big Data Analytics, today we would like to touch base on SAP GRC solution. I'm sure, being an auditor or controls person, this topic comes to our discussion quite often, and part of our, the very first thing is a part of our scoping. So that's all, we would like to cover, keeping this mind, how the segregation of duty, how the SAP GRC access management, can be reviewed, can be understood well in terms of its rule book and all those stuff. So we are going to cover these 4 topics in this, and it's SAP GRC itself is a very big element or subject matter, but we are taking up very briefly the overview of these components, which is the starting step to understand the entire library and how to go about it. So we'll touch base on the SAP GRC brief part, what exactly is SAP GRC, what are its components. Then we'll talk about the access control mechanism, how the segregation of duty works, and what is the concept of rulebook, risk universe, and all those things. So SAP GRC stands for Governance, Risk, and Compliance, which helps organization to manage the risk with its 3 unique feature or elements. One is ability to analyze what kind of the business risk in terms of accessing or giving access to the user, then how you manage the risk, and how the monitoring controls are defined and who monitors those controls and what kind of documentations are there to ensure things are in place. When we talk about largely components of GRC, the very first thing is the access control and SOD risk management. Then it talks about the process controls and fraud management, where we have a ability or functionality in the system to trigger out the workflows or to notify the respective process owners or person in charge or whosoever is authorized to perform that control, that hey, something has went wrong or some approvals are required or some SOD is there. You have to perform the control and retain the documentations around it. And when it's sitting on the SAP, it gives you a leverage that whatever exceptions arises. For example, someone has created or released a PO and also did the GRM. So that is a part of SOD conflict, and it throws away straight away to the defined mitigating monitor that okay, this transaction has happened, and this has SOD conflict. You may need to review, and it depends upon what kind of customization we do at organization to organization level. Then it also gives us a platform where we can document the entire risk universe, risk library, and tag it with the enterprise risk controls metrics over there. It of course also gives an opportunity, a platform to document, to plan, to scope the audit universe as well. So it's an SAP GRC solution is providing you end-to-end solution from the audit side, assurance side, and it's very useful for any organization. However, in this session, we are going to understand largely on the access management, how it works, and as an auditor or controls person, how do you need to look into it. So when we talk about access management, typically we need to understand what kind of business roles we may have. Are the roles created rightly or not? Are these roles are position-based role or person-based role? When we say position-based role, it could be, a role of a store clerk, a role of a payment clerk, a role of a invoice clerk, role of a controller. So what typically the transactions these people do, or these functions or position do rather, that's the right word to use, the position, and accordingly the transaction codes, authorization objects, activities are assigned to these position, and we create a role. And that role is free from SOD conflict, because we do a simulation also on the GRC platform to understand within the role we should not have any conflicting transactions around it. And when we create a role, we also keep in mind what kind of authorizations we are giving to this particular position, because what happens in SAP, transaction code itself is not enough. In each transaction code, we will have authorization objects, activity, whether this activity is display activity or creation activity or change activity. And authorization object can also go at minute level, because in SAP, to perform a transaction or to perform an activity, you're not dependent only with one transaction code. You may do the transaction with similar transaction code which is available in the standard library or in the customized version. So it is very important to understand that whether we have taken into account all the transaction codes in the library or not, and to ensure that accordingly right authorizations are mapped towards it. We also need to understand the user master. What are the different type of users in the system or what we create? The dialog user, which is the most common one, which is like people like you and me, humans, who are going to do the transactions. Then there could be system user, communication, service, reference. These are system users. When we set up SAP, there could be many other applications which are connected, and then times we do data movement through interface, and there we need system users also. Sometimes we schedule a job, a backend job or something, there we need system users. So those are taken care by basis team largely, but this is something on the dialog user side where we need to understand how the access being given to them, and how, and this is a checkpoint, because to log in into SAP, you have to have first user management, and that user management should have authorization to log in and should have authorization to respective transactions to get into the system part. So that's how we are going to understand more about it in the access management part. Then when we talk about the access part, the very first thing, or as a question comes to every auditor, is what happens if we give him sensitive access, or what happens if we give him or give her access which is resulting in the SOD conflict. So very first thing, what is the meaning of SOD conflict? We keep hearing all this term, but really to understand what exactly SOD conflict means. In a simple term, when a user is having access of two consecutive activity which is significant in nature and can result in completing the activity to a certain stage, that means there is an SOD conflict. Examples are many. For example, someone is having access to reopen the period in post accounting entry. Someone is having the access to release the purchase order and make the goods receipt. Someone is having access to create purchase requisition and release purchase requisition. So you are able to achieve one stage of activity in a manner that it is good enough to take the next steps of completing the transaction. Then we can say in a simple term, there is an SOD conflict around it. And the possible consequences could be anything. The person can have a collision with a third party and to do the transaction and ultimately siphon off the amount, or doing inappropriate transactions to safeguard his or her own incentive or commission during sales time. So I mean, there are many combinations around it, but as a bottom line, if you have the conflicting roles, conflicting access, I mean, there is an ability to exploit the system, and that is where we, as an auditor or as a management, we would be always trying to prevent it. And at times we need to set up some kind of monitoring mechanism to ensure things are not going out of control. And that's where we need to understand the overall rule book concept, how the rule book work, how exactly system throws whether there's an SOD conflict or not. And as an auditor, how would you go about to understand, okay, this is how the SOD rule book should have been designed, and it has been designed like this way, where is the gap around it? So first of all, we need to understand the business risk. What could be the business risk which an organization can happen depending upon the size of the entity, nature of the business? Is it a trading business or a manufacturing business or a sales business, whatever? We need to understand what are the various types of activity which happen and which could result in terms of SOD conflict. Those typically, when we talk about for any standard organization, a big size organization, it depends upon 150 to 200 risk IDs that are really there. For example, making false payment is a risk ID. For example, making false procurement is a risk ID. Now, under this risk ID, there could be many combinations around it. Creating a purchase order, releasing a purchase order, creating a contract, or releasing a contract and creating a purchase order. Those are the various multiple permutation combinations which are then tagged to the risk IDs which we have defined, which is sitting on the larger level. So This is called rule set. When we say that, okay, permutation combinations are coming up, these are the rule set which we define, like in the example, what we are saying about, we say that ME29N, which is a transaction code to release the purchase order, and there is a transaction code to do the GRN, MIGO. When these two things are there in any access, for any user's access, then there is a SOD conflict. So this rule we have to create in the system, and like that way, typically the rule IDs go from 60,000 to 70,000 in a decent size organization, where we define all those transaction code at transaction code and authorization level, authorization object level. These two combinations we define, and accordingly we say that, okay, this transaction and this authorization, if come together, there is a risk, and that risk has to be tagged to the risk ID. And then this risk ID is further tagged to the mitigating control. And this is how the entire structure comes up. I'll take you through in the next slide how the chart is being prepared. That will help you to understand more on that. But this is typically how the rule ID or rule book is prepared. First, we define or identify the business risk. Then we find out the rule IDs, which are permutation combination basis transaction code of object. These are then tagged to the risk ID. And then we identify mitigating controls or design mitigating controls. Those mitigating controls are again tagged back to risk ID. So in a summary, in an organization, 160 to 200, generally the risk IDs are, the risk statements are, 60 to 70,000 permutation combination, which we say rule ID. And then against each risk ID, we have unique mitigating control, or we can create one mitigating control that can cater multiple risk ID depending upon what kind of control environment that organization is following. That way it can be managed. But this is typically the structure part of the entire SOD rule book. Let me take you through the illustration. We just create the position-based role. We discussed about it could be payment clerk, it could be store clerk, it could be finance controller, right? Then we have acceptable transaction that, okay, for this role, for example, if we talk about store clerk, the acceptable transaction is to record MIGO for inventory movement, right? Sorry, to record inventory movement, and for that you need a transaction code MIGO. Then suppose if that user requests for another T code, which is ME29N, and this is for the purchase order release, then this goes to the reporting manager for the approval. And reporting manager may not be aware about whether this transaction code will result into conflicting or not, because those people do not understand what can go wrong, and because they could be a supply chain reporting manager, or the reporting manager could be from a function like marketing or sales or whatever. So this is a subject matter which generally finance people understand more, that, okay, this could result into a SOD conflict, how we have to go about it. But we cannot, it's very difficult to explain other function also in an organization, and that's where system controls play a vital role around it. So the moment we get approval in the system that, okay, this user who got access to MIGO already, now he has requested for ME29, which has been approved by the reporting manager. System checks. Now, if we add ME29N as a transaction code, which we have already mapped in a rule ID, system understand, oh, this is an SOD conflict, and triggers SOD conflict, right? And when the SOD conflict gets triggered, it requires approval from the SOD approver, which an organization again decide that, okay, they want a dedicated person who is going to handle all the SOD requests or all the SOD transactions. So that gets, that gets notified to that person, and that person has to understand whether to reject it. So he may or she may reject it and send it back to the reporting manager and say, you may need to relook, you may need to withdraw the transaction request. If you do not want to withdraw transaction request, give us justification. So the justification comes, and accordingly approval happens. But that approval happens basis the defined mitigating control on a condition that you guys need to perform the mitigating control, or we have defined a mitigating monitor. That mitigating monitor has to perform the mitigating control to ensure this gets reviewed over there. So this is how the risk mitigation happens. In an organization, you may have a situation that you may have to give multiple transaction codes authorization to a user depending upon the bandwidth. However, the objective is that Do we have defined mitigating controls around it? And those mitigating controls have been performed by the mitigating monitors, so that we say that, okay, yes, we know there has been SOD conflict, but those has been mitigated by a monitoring control, and we have documentary evidence to show that. I hope this gives you a better clarity around it. And this typically is the kind of reports which we can get to analyze better. For example, in this you can see there is a specific rule ID which is having a combination LHS and RHS, which is left hand side and the right hand side, OB53 and F-02. OB53 is basically transaction code to reopen the period. Anyone can reopen the closed period. Let's say sitting in the month of September, if you want to reopen the period of April because you want to do some accounting entry, it's very sensitive T code. So that is a T code if it's the authorization is having with any person in combination with posting of accounting entry. So these two are the SOD conflict, that creates SOD conflict. So basically this we have defined in rule ID, which is XY1, and it is mapped to a risk ID, which is R2R1, where we are stating the description that period reopen and posting inappropriate entry, that's a risk. We also categorize the risk rating as a high, moderate, low, so it's a high risk. Then we have defined a mitigating control that on a monthly basis, finance controller reviews accounting entries posted post reopening of period, and the mitigating monitor is Mr. Alex, who has to perform it. So this is typically documented in the SOD rulebook, and accountingly, this is the master. If anything happens like that for any user, it gets triggered, and accordingly it notifies to respective people to ensure the controls have been performed. And when we see the actual transaction of SOD, we get this kind of report that, okay, taking above example, we also get to know that who all are the users having this conflict, these users belong to which user group, and how many transactions they have executed. Sometimes what happens, we give access to the user, but they have not done any transaction. So, in that situation, the risk is still there as a potential risk, but something, you can say that no transaction has been performed. So at least we are a little bit in a comfortable position that at least transactions were not performed. But however, there is a potential risk, and we need to be alert on that, okay, if this transaction happens, we have to perform monitoring control around it. So this is all about, SOD rule book and access management, very crisp and short session, and hope you guys will understand. And any questions, if you have, you can reach us separately, and we are planning to have more sessions around it, a short one, so that we can connect better around it. Thanks.